The day Opal Renner got down on her knees in the middle of Gate B14 at Denver International Airport was not the worst day of her life, but it came close. She had been on her feet for 17 hours before that moment. The shift before her flight had run long, the way shifts at St. Agatha's always ran long in February, when the ICU was full and the hallways smelled like antiseptic and quiet dread. She had changed out of her scrubs in the hospital bathroom, pulled on jeans and a gray hoodie that said nothing about who she was or what she did, packed her bag in the locker room with the efficiency of someone who had learned to move fast in small spaces and driven 40 minutes to Dia in a car that needed an oil change and a passenger to talk to. She hadn't slept in what felt like a geological era. The gate was crowded. Flight to Savannah, connecting through Atlanta, delayed 40 minutes, which meant she had time to find a seat near the window and eat something that wasn't vending machine crackers. She found a cafe cart near the gate, ordered a coffee and a turkey sandwich, paid with the card that had exactly enough on it to cover both without drama, and started making her way back to a row of seats near the window where the low afternoon light came through and made everything look a little more bearable than it was. She didn't see the bag strap, or she saw it too late. Her right foot caught it, and then everything happened in the compressed, merciless way that embarrassing things always happen. All at once, no pauses, no mercy. She went down hard, both knees hitting the carpet, the coffee going sideways and splashing across the front of her hoodie, the sandwich hitting the floor and sliding 3 feet away from her like it wanted nothing to do with what was happening. There was a silence, then laughter. Not from everyone, maybe 4 or 5 people, in a loose cluster near the gate seating. Young guys, early 20s, the kind who had probably been drinking since noon and thought airports were funny in general. One of them said something she couldn't fully catch, but she heard the word clumsy, and she heard seriously, and she heard the sound of a phone camera clicking. Oh man, she's on her knees. That one she caught clearly. More laughter. Opal stayed down for a second longer than she needed to. Not because she was hurt. Her knees ached, but nothing was broken. But because she was doing the calculation that women do in those moments, the quick internal math of how much dignity she had left, how much she wanted to spend on a confrontation, and whether any of it was worth it. She was 31 years old. She had pulled a 40-year-old man back from cardiac arrest 14 hours ago. She had held a woman's hand at 3 in the morning while that woman said goodbye to a husband of 52 years. She had done all of this in the same pair of shoes she was currently wearing, on the same legs that had just failed her in front of a crowd of strangers, and she was so tired that the floor felt like a reasonable place to stay. She picked up the sandwich. She stood. She didn't look at the group. One of them was still talking. "You okay down there, sweetheart?" The sweetheart landed like a flick to the ear. She turned toward them then, not because she had a plan, but because her body made the decision before her brain could argue. They were exactly what she'd pictured. 4 of them, one with a phone still up, one with a boarding pass dangling from his hand like a flag. They were young and loud, and they had the particular confidence of people who had never had a very bad day. "I'm fine," she said. "Good," said the one with the phone. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a polo shirt with a small logo on the chest, the kind of shirt that cost $200 and was designed to look casual. "Next time, maybe watch where you're going." "There it is," said another one, grinning. The thing about being that tired is that your filters stop working entirely. Opal had a very good filter most of the time. 17 years of Catholic school and then a decade of nursing had installed it like hardware. She knew how to smile when she didn't mean it, how to nod when someone was wrong, how to step back from the edge of things. But at hour 18 of her shift plus travel day, with coffee soaking into her hoodie and her knees still singing and a phone camera pointed at her face, the filter simply wasn't there. "You know what?" she said quietly, not loudly. "I just came off a 17-hour ICU shift. I haven't slept, my coffee is on my shirt, and I'm pretty sure you just filmed that. So I'm going to go sit down now because I'm too tired to do anything useful here. But I want you to know that what you just did was mean. Just genuinely, pointlessly mean." She said it the way she said hard things to patients' families. Not angrily, but clearly. Like she was delivering information. The one with the phone laughed. "ICU shift. Sure. Didn't look like a nurse to me," said another. "What does a nurse look like?" she said. Nobody answered that. She picked up what was left of her dignity and her ruined coffee and walked to the far end of the gate. She found a seat with her back to most of the room, pressed her forehead briefly against the cool window glass, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry in Gate B14 of Denver International Airport over a spilled coffee and 4 idiots. She told herself this 3 times. It worked about 60%. She had almost stopped shaking by the time she heard the dog. Not barking, just the specific sound of a large dog moving through a crowd, nails on hard floor, a low breath. She didn't look up at first, then the sound stopped near her, and she looked. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 75 pounds, wearing a vest that said Surface Animal in block letters. It was sitting approximately 1 foot from her left knee, looking up at her with the focused, serious attention that working dogs have, like they've already assessed the situation and made their decision and are simply waiting for you to catch up. Behind the dog stood a man holding the leash. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, but carrying himself the way that certain men carry themselves, a posture that had been installed by years of something rigorous. His hair was short and starting to go gray at the temples. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder and a look on his face that was careful and watchful, and not at all unkind. "Sorry," he said. "She does this sometimes. I can move her if you want." Opal looked at the dog. The dog was still looking at her with that complete, uncomplicated attention. "It's okay," Opal said. "She's not bothering me. She's trained to notice when people are having a hard time." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd say she knows her commands or she doesn't like the cold. "She doesn't always know when to keep walking. Smart dog. Smartest thing in my house," he said, which is not a high bar, but still. He took the seat 2 down from her, the dog settling between them on the floor with the air of someone who had decided the situation was handled. Up close, Opal could see he had the particular kind of tired face that came from something more than a long travel day, something longer and deeper than that, the kind of tired that had become structural, the way water eventually shapes stone. "Flight to Atlanta?" she asked, mostly to say something. "Connecting to Savannah," he said. "Same." She looked at the gate board. 40 minutes still. "You live there?" "Going to see my sister," he said. "I'm based out of Colorado Springs," she nodded. "That was military, probably. Peterson or Fort Carson." She didn't ask. "You?" he said. "Same flight, conference. I'm a nurse." She didn't know why she said that last part, except that she was still raw from 20 minutes ago, and it felt important to be something to a stranger who had no reason to think less of her for it. "ICU?" he said. She blinked. "How did you know that?" He looked at her hands briefly. "You've been doing the thing where you're checking if your hands are clean. You've done it 4 times since I sat down. That's either a nervous habit or someone who washes their hands every 20 minutes professionally." She looked down at her hands. She hadn't even realized she was doing it. "ICU," she confirmed. "My daughter was in the ICU for 11 days when she was 9, he said. He said it the way people say things they have made peace with, facts that have been turned over so many times they've become smooth. The nurses there, I don't know how to explain what they were. They were something else, not just medical. Something else." Opal didn't say anything. She'd heard variations of this before, and she knew the right response was to receive it quietly. "I'm Danner," he said. "Rhett Danner, Opal Renner." The dog's ears moved at the sound of her name, which was the most charming thing that had happened to Opal in recent memory. "That's Colt," he said, nodding at the dog. "She answers to it, despite it being a terrible name for a female dog. Previous handler named her. I inherited her." "Previous handler?" He paused. A small pause, the kind that contains a sentence that doesn't get said. "He didn't come home from our last deployment." Opal held that for a second. "I'm sorry. Me too." He reached down without looking and laid his hand briefly on the dog's back, and the dog pressed against his fingers. She works better than I do most days. I'm not supposed to admit that, but it's true." Something about the way he said it, the quiet admission of it, without apology or performance, made Opal feel like she could breathe for the first time since she'd walked into this airport. She didn't tell him about the group near the gate. Not then. They talked about small things. The length of the delay, the particular misery of middle seats on a 2-hour flight, a coffee shop in Colorado Springs he liked that she'd probably never go to. Colt stayed on the floor between them and occasionally shifted her enormous head onto Opal's shoe, which was not behavior that Opal understood, but which she found deeply soothing. She found out he was a chief warrant officer. She found it out sideways, the way you find things out when someone isn't performing their identity at you. He mentioned it in the context of a story about paperwork, something about the military's capacity to generate paperwork in direct proportion to how little anyone wanted to deal with it. And she caught the rank the way you catch a detail that the speaker doesn't think is the point. She didn't make a thing of it. He found out she'd been a nurse for 8 years, that she'd almost gone to medical school and decided against it for reasons she still couldn't explain clearly to herself, that her specialty was cardiac care, but she'd been pulled into general ICU 3 years ago during a staffing crisis and had never quite left. "You ever think about getting out?" he asked. Not provocatively, actually asking. Of nursing? Of the hard part of it? She thought about it honestly. "I think about it every time I lose someone, and then the next shift starts and I stop thinking about it because there's no time." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, you? Every time something goes wrong," he said, "and then someone needs me to know what I know, and I stop thinking about it." They sat with that for a while. The gate was getting louder around them as boarding time approached, but their small corner of it felt like a separate temperature. That was when one of the group from earlier walked past. The one with the polo shirt, the one who'd had the phone. He was looking at his boarding pass and nearly walked into the row, checked himself, looked up. His eyes moved from Opal to the man next to her to the dog with its service vest, and then did the specific recalibration that certain people do when context shifts suddenly beneath them. He kept walking. Opal watched him go. "Something?" Danner said quietly. She hesitated. "Group of guys near the gate laughed at me when I fell earlier. Filmed it. Said some things." He didn't say anything right away. She appreciated that he didn't immediately jump to a response, didn't perform outrage or fill the air with words. "The one who just walked past?" he said. "One of them, yeah." He nodded. He saw Colt. He changed his whole face when he saw her. They usually do. He wasn't saying it with satisfaction, exactly. Just observationally. "You okay?" She considered the question the way she always considered the question when patients asked it, the way she'd been asked it 20 minutes ago by a stranger who meant the opposite, and she thought about the honest answer. "I was embarrassed," she said, "and tired. And I let them make me feel small, which is worse than being embarrassed. I don't love that I let that happen." "You didn't let it happen," he said. "They did something unkind and you were tired and human. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him. "You're very direct. 17 years in the military will do that," he said, "or it'll do the opposite. Depends on the person's. Which one are you?" "Direct," he said. "It's a problem sometimes. My sister says I have no small talk, which is probably why I'm telling a stranger about my dead colleague's dog on an airport bench." "I'm glad you did," she said. And she meant it. Boarding started. The announcements came over the intercom in the cheerful, aggressively neutral voice of all airport announcements, and the crowd near Gate B14 began to move and shuffle and reorganize itself into the particular geometry of lines. Opal gathered her bag. The coffee had dried to a vague stain on her hoodie. Her knees were still sore. She had her boarding pass pulled up on her phone, her section not called yet. Danner stood and Colt rose with him in one fluid movement, immediately attentive, immediately present. He clipped the leash differently, shorter, closer, the way you adjust when a space gets crowded. "Group A," she asked. "Active duty," he said. "Pre-board." He looked at her. "You're going to be okay." It was a simple sentence. She had said versions of it herself, to patients, to families, in different registers for different situations. She knew how empty it could sound. But the way he said it was not the professional version. It was the version that meant, "I see you and I mean this specifically." "I know," she said, which was also a thing she'd learned to say and mean at the same time. He nodded once. He moved toward the jetway with Colt, and the dog glanced back at her once. That same focused, decided look, before they disappeared into the boarding line. Opal stood at the window. Outside, the planes were moving in the gray afternoon light, huge and slow and deliberate. A ground crew in orange vests moved between them. The mountains were barely visible through the overcast, just a darkening at the edge of the horizon. She thought about what he'd said. "They did something unkind and you were tired and human." She thought about the specific arithmetic of a shift like today's. The things she had given, and the things that had been taken, and the thin remainder of herself that still had to get on a plane and sit in a middle seat and arrive somewhere and be useful to people. She thought about what she did for a living. She thought about the fact that she had never, not once, in 8 years, thought of it as something that defined her. It was just what she did, the way other people just did other things, accountants and teachers and engineers moving through their days with the same mix of tedium and consequence and exhaustion. She did not think of herself as extraordinary. She thought of herself as someone who showed up. She thought about the polo shirt guy and his phone. She thought about Colt and how the dog had put her head on her shoe without being asked. She thought, you let them make you feel small. And then she corrected herself the way Danner had corrected her. No, they did something, and she was tired and human. And those were two separate facts. Her section was called. She found her seat, middle seat of course, because that was the kind of day it was, between a teenager with headphones and a man in his 60s reading a paperback thriller. She buckled her belt, put her bag under the seat, and looked at her hands in her lap. She was good at this, at the getting on with it. You had to be in her line of work, or the weight of things accumulated until it was all you were carrying. You cried in the parking lot, or in the supply closet, or occasionally in airport bathrooms, and then you went back. You learned which things to hold and which to let move through you. You learned that being good at something hard did not require you to pretend the hard parts weren't hard. The teenager next to her fell asleep before takeoff. The man on her right read his thriller without looking up. The plane filled and quieted and started to move. She found herself thinking about the conversation at the gate with the peculiar clarity she only got when she was exhausted past the point of filtering things. It had been a very strange 40 minutes. She had fallen in a crowd and been mocked, and then sat next to a man with a Belgian Malinois named Colt, who had said things that cut through the noise more effectively than anything she'd expected from a stranger in an airport. She thought, I don't know anything about him, not really. She knew his name and his rank, and that his daughter had been in the ICU, and that he was going to Savannah to see his sister, and that his dead colleague's dog trusted him enough to follow him anywhere. She knew that he'd watched the world for a very long time with that careful, particular attention, and that the attention had landed on her with a precision that felt in the moment exactly like being seen. She didn't know what he had done in those 17 years that made him carry himself that way. She didn't know what the deployment had cost him, not in abstractions, but in the specific granular way that costs are paid. She didn't know the shape of the grief he'd carried onto the plane. She knew he'd been kind. That was what she knew. In 22C, separated by several rows and a dog who was probably better behaved than most of the humans on the flight, Rhett Danner sat with Colt settled at his feet, and the familiar low hum of flight beginning beneath him. He had not been planning to stop. He'd seen the woman on the floor in his peripheral vision and registered it as one of those things that happened in crowded spaces, the bag strap, the fall, the cascade of small disasters, and he'd kept walking, because that was the rational thing to do, and he had somewhere to be, and she didn't seem injured. Then Colt had stopped. Colt did this with a small number of people, and she had never been wrong. Some part of her training and some part of what she was had combined into something Danner couldn't fully explain, only observe. The dog knew when a person needed company. Not medical distress, not danger, just needed. And when she decided, she sat, and there was no moving her until she was ready, so they had stayed. He thought about the way Opal Renner had said, I let them make me feel small. The guilt in it, the extra accounting she'd done on herself, adding her own reaction to the ledger of things that had gone wrong. He'd recognized it. It was the same accounting he'd done for years after certain decisions, certain moments when he'd been tired and human, and had somehow added that to the list of failures, instead of just the list of things that had happened. It had taken a long time to learn the difference. He hoped she'd get there faster than he had. Colt shifted, pressed the side of her face against his boot, and sighed with the enormous sincerity of a dog who considers sighing a full-body commitment. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. The conference in Savannah was fine. The presentations were the kind that ran together by the end of the second day. Evidence-based this, patient outcomes that, a panel discussion about staffing ratios that made everyone in the room tired and a little angry in a way they all recognized but couldn't do anything about in a hotel ballroom in February. Opal presented a case study on early intervention protocols that she had spent 3 weeks writing and that ran 16 minutes and went well, she thought, or at least generated questions, which was what you wanted. She had dinner with a cardiologist from Houston and a fellow ICU nurse from Minneapolis who had been doing this for 20 years and had a particular gift for making the whole enterprise feel survivable, which was its own kind of expertise. She did not think about Gate B14 every minute, but she thought about it. She thought about it on the second morning when she walked past the hotel's breakfast setup and caught herself doing the exact thing, checking her hands without meaning to, and recognized it for the first time as the habit it had become. She thought about it when she called her mother in the evening, and her mother asked how the trip was, and she said, "Fine, good, exhausting," and did not say, "I fell in an airport, and a stranger with a therapy dog made me feel less like a failure than I've felt in months." She thought about it on the flight home, in a window seat she'd specifically paid extra for, watching the Atlantic coastline fall away below. She thought, "Smartest thing in my house," which is not a high bar. She smiled at the window. The man across the aisle noticed and looked away politely. The thing Opal thought about most, on the flight home and in the days after, was not the cruelty of the guys at the gate, or the coffee on her hoodie, or even the moment of falling itself. Those things had a way of losing their edges fairly quickly, once enough time and sleep intervened. What she thought about was the word Danner had used, human. You were tired and human. In nursing school, they talked about burnout in terms of symptoms and prevention and self-care strategies that everyone nodded at and nobody followed because there wasn't time. They talked about compassion fatigue like it was a pathology, something that happened to you when you ran your reserves too low, a treatable condition with identifiable onset and manageable interventions. Nobody had ever said to her, simply, "You were tired and human," and had the word human sound like a complete defense rather than an explanation for a failure. She thought about what it would mean to say that to the nurses she supervised. Not as a therapeutic gesture, not as management language, but in the way a person said it to another person, directly, at hour 18 in an airport with a dog sitting on their shoe. She thought it might mean quite a lot. She went back to work on a Thursday. The ICU was the ICU, fluorescent and urgent and contained. She suited up in the locker room, went through the handoff, took her patients. A man in his 50s recovering from a triple bypass who was frustrated and scared and expressed both of those things by being difficult in ways that required patience. A woman in her 30s who had been in a car accident and was still not fully conscious and whose husband sat in the chair by the window every day from 7 to 7 and held her hand. At 3 in the afternoon, one of the younger nurses on the floor, Demi, 24, fresh out of her first year, still learning the particular economy of this place, knocked her elbow against a supply cart and sent a tray of instruments clattering across the hallway floor. The sound was loud. Several people looked. Demi went red all the way to her hairline and dropped to her knees to pick things up, apologizing to no one in particular in a rapid, flustered voice. Opal crossed the hallway without hesitating, crouched down beside her, and started picking up instruments. "It's okay," she said. "Not the professional version, the other one. You were moving fast and tired. Those are two separate things from this." Demi looked at her, surprised. "I should have been more careful." "You should be careful," Opal agreed. "And you were tired and human. Both of those are true." She said it the way she'd heard it said, directly, without a lot of cushioning around it. Something in Demi's face changed. The redness didn't disappear, but the mortification behind it shifted into something more manageable. "Come on," Opal said. "Help me get these sorted." She didn't run into Rhett Danner again. She had not expected to. That was not how the world worked most of the time. People came through and said what they said and moved on, and the meaningful ones left something behind without knowing they had. She thought sometimes about the conference and the red-eye home and the specific way that February had felt like a long corridor with no particular end, and how a 40-minute delay in Denver had carved itself into that month in a way nothing else quite had. She thought about what it meant that a dog she'd never met had simply decided she needed company and had been exactly right. She had started to recognize more carefully the moments when she herself did that, when something in a patient's face or posture or the particular silence of their room told her, "Stay, don't do the efficient thing. Just stay." She had always done it, had done it for 8 years, was good at it, but she recognized it more now, understood it as a specific and important skill that did not show up in her performance reviews, but was perhaps the most essential thing she did. She wrote about it eventually in a professional journal submission that took her 2 months and 3 drafts. The submission was about the non-clinical dimensions of ICU care, about presence as intervention, about the things that couldn't be measured in patient outcomes, but that shaped them nonetheless. It was accepted without major revisions, which surprised her, and published in the spring. She listed her specialty as cardiac ICU, St. Agatha's, Denver, Colorado. She did not list the Belgian Malinois or the man from Colorado Springs or Gate B14 as data points, but she thought about them once when she read the final proof and thought evidence-based. The polo shirt guy never came back around in her life, which was fine. She imagined, on occasion, that he had watched the video he'd taken and found it less funny than he'd expected, or that the moment had receded for him the way unkind impulses sometimes do when you're not in the middle of them anymore. She did not spend much time on this imagining. The expenditure didn't seem worth it. What she spent time on was different. She spent time on Demi learning to recover without dismantling herself. She spent time on the husband at the window who held his wife's hand every day from 7 to 7. She spent time on the man recovering from his bypass who had stopped being difficult by day 3 and had started, hesitantly, to say thank you. Not as a formality, but like he meant it, the way you mean things when you are scared and then less scared, and someone was there for the whole arc of that. She spent time on the things she was good at. One evening in March, locking up her locker after a long shift, she found herself doing the hand check again, the reflexive, unconscious washing gesture, and caught it this time, held it, and smiled at her own hands. Smartest thing in my house. She put on her coat. She went to the parking lot, where her car still needed an oil change, and she still had nobody to talk to on the drive home, and she drove home in the dark with the radio on low, and she was tired, and she was human, and those were 2 separate facts from anything that had gone wrong.